she suddenly realizes that she's been lied to and that he's dead. And she's told that, yes, indeed, he has been executed. And she goes into a sort of state of shock, and she doesn't move or speak. And there's this sort of description of her sitting there, and darkness falls, and eventually one of her relations takes her by the hand and leads her from the room. But this is not the end of her life. It's the end of her husband's life. And she lives for another sort of 20 years, and a very full and interesting life it is too.
Hello and welcome to this week's pod. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. It's great to welcome new listeners, as I can see according to my dashboard. Please do keep on spreading the word. Today's episode is on a less well-known, but nonetheless hugely influential figure, Henrietta Maria, Queen Consort of England, Scotland and Ireland, wife to the executed Charles I, mother to the philanderer King Charles II, and mother to the catastrophic King James II. She's been very much defined by these lacklustre monarchs until now, as Leanda de Lisle, the author of Henrietta Maria, Conspirator, Warrior, Phoenix Queen, will establish today. Now, Henrietta Maria married Charles as a child, but lived and reigned through some of the most tumultuous periods in history. Religious wars, assassinations, pandemics, civil wars and regicides were all swirling around the first half of 17th century Europe. History has not been kind to her. She's been described as a popish whore, a manipulator and heretic. But as we'll hear from Leanda, none of these things are true. I've put links to Leanda's book in the show notes, along with a couple of articles related to what we're talking about. One on Charles's execution and one on Henrietta Maria herself, both by Leanda. This episode makes up 3 parts of Civil War podcasts I've done now. So if you haven't listened to them, we've done one on Charles I and the Civil War with Mark Turnbull, and on Oliver Cromwell with Miranda Mallon. So you can go back and listen to them if you haven't already. Coming up in January, we'll be concentrating fully on the trial and execution of Charles I with Mark Turnbull again. But this time we'll go into quite a bit of detail, it being the anniversary. If you can subscribe or even write a review, I'd be hugely grateful. As I mentioned last week, for listeners of this podcast, I'm offering a 50% discount on an annual subscription to our e-magazine. Down from $9.99, already cheap, to only £5 or dollars. You can gift, so with the cost of living crisis and Christmas round the corner, perhaps aspects of history can help. In the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking to Leanda de Lisle. Leanda de Lisle, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you on, and we're here to discuss Henrietta Maria, your new book, Conspirator, Warrior, and Phoenix Queen. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, I've been loving this book. It's a fascinating story, and actually, I've been rather primed up for it because I was doing a bonus podcast on the top 10 families of world history, and so I had the Medicis in there. You'll be very upset I didn't have the Bourbons or the Stuarts in there. They're in the sort of second tier. But she's a fascinating woman, Henrietta Maria, or even her childhood in particular. And I wanted to start off with her childhood because she's got Medici blood in her veins. She's a Bourbon. And growing up in that rather bizarre family was quite a start to her life, wasn't it?
Yes. She was the daughter. Well, she was named after both her parents. So Henrietta. Henry, her father, Henri IV of France, Henry the Great of France, who was assassinated when she was a baby, around 6 months old. And then her mother, Henrietta Maria, Maria de Medici, who was a quite extraordinary figure in her own right, and was regent of France for a number of years after the assassination of her husband.
Can you clear something up for me on Henry the Great? Henri of Navarre originally, wasn't he?
Yes.
Before he became king. Now, he was the listeners should be familiar with the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, because I've talked about that in this bonus podcast. But is it the case that Henri was during that massacre advised or agreed to convert to Catholicism as a Huguenot, as he was, at the point of a sword, and then subsequently converted? So in other words, not, I don't know.
No. He converted much. He converted much later than that.
But did he not agree at St. Bartholomew Day massacre to convert?
At the point of the sword, I don't think he was that kind of person.
Right.
No, I think he converted for political reasons, that the majority of the population of France and of Paris were Catholic, and he felt that to heal the country and to be accepted as King of France, he would need to become a Catholic. His apocryphal words were, Paris is worth a mass.
Wonderful. Well, just exploring Henrietta Maria's childhood a little bit, because Henry had rather an unusual. Reading in the early chapters of your book, Henry has rather a bizarre parenting style, doesn't he? With Louis, his son, who becomes Louis XIII, and his eldest daughter as well.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, he's such an admired figure, Henry, and Marie de Medici, his wife, is always sort of presented as this rather sort of cold figure, and lots of sort of negative things are associated with her, whereas he's a sort of great sort of hero. And the fact that he had sort of lots of mistresses and so forth is looked on with, he's a sort of Boris Johnson type figure, oh, how funny and how amusing and so forth. But as so often with these sorts of people, there's actually something rather sort of seedy and sordid behind it, I think. And as he got older, it's notable that his tastes in women seemed to get younger and younger. Certainly in his last years, he was pursuing a girl of, I think she was sort of 14. And he dumped wife number one because she didn't produce an heir, and married Marie de Medici, and she did have a son, Louis, the future Louis XIII. So Henry was thrilled about this, the first Dauphin to have been born in 80 years, I think he was. But he seems to he was a sort of quite old man by this stage, in his 50s. And maybe he felt or feared some kind of physical decline. I don't know. Maybe it's just interesting that this was the time he started pursuing this 14-year-old girl. And with his son, he became completely obsessed about his son's virility as a baby and toddler, and would sort of, when his son was a tiny boy, would sort of show him the father would sort of show him his erect penis and take him to bed with his infant daughter and sort of show them each other's sort of genitals. And it's just what we would call child abuse, really. And I sort of read this, and I did think to myself, what's this about? Is this some kind of fear of his own loss of his own potency, that he now has a son, or something creepy? It was very creepy.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Put it mildly.
Yeah. So Henrietta Maria is born into this family, but as I think you mentioned, she's her father is assassinated early on, and then she's sort of primed for, well, they're very keen, the Bourbons, to have her marry Charles, but he's looking at the Habsburgs in Spain as well. Or James, his father, is looking at marrying Charles to the Habsburgs. Is that right?
Yes. Charles has a sister, Elizabeth, who's married to Prince Palatine, and he, rather recklessly and against the advice of his father-in-law, King James, accepts the crown of Bohemia, which the Habsburgs had expected. to hold. And the result was provoked a war with the Habsburgs and lost not only Bohemia, but also the Palatine. And so James was anxious not to have to go to war over this and was trying to look for a way around it. And he thought a marriage between Charles and a Spanish infanta, part of the sort of dowry, you might say, could be the return of the Palatine to his daughter, Charles's sister. So Charles goes to Spain. He goes via France. He goes with James's favourite, Duke of Buckingham, to woo the Infanta, and it's all sort of complete disaster and a sort of fiasco. And Charles becomes very angry with the Habsburgs and decides he was just being strung along. And he decides that the best thing to do is indeed to go to war with the Habsburgs. And for that, he needs a French alliance. And so he negotiates a marriage with the then 15-year-old Henrietta Maria. And I suppose what's important to remember about this is that from Henrietta Maria's perspective, a very important aspect of the marriage was that it was very much in the tradition of her father, Henri IV's alliances with Protestant nations against the Habsburgs. She saw it very much in that light, and that's indeed what it was.
She did make a promise to the Pope when that she would raise her children as Catholics, and that seemed to me, reading your book, that seemed to be rather an optimistic promise to make, because England at the time was not exactly enamored with Catholicism.
No, I mean, Charles was the greatest persecutor of Catholics in Europe. Well, she was made to promise more than one thing. She was the first sort of Catholic princess to marry a Protestant monarch, and the Pope wasn't going to give permission just sort of willy-nilly. So obviously he wanted, first of all, to see some reduction in the persecution of Catholics in England. Now, there's nothing much Henrietta Maria could do about the persecution, but she was told that she should act as a protector of Catholics as much as she could, and also to set an example that might inspire conversions. On the matter of her children, it was quite usual for small children, young children, to be in the care of their mother. And she was told that, while they were in her care, they should be raised as Catholics. And Charles did actually agree to this, although it wasn't to happen, unsurprisingly.
Reading their early moments together, it's actually it seemed quite sweet. There's a bit of affection between the two. But early on, her kind of reputation is settled almost in England, isn't it? She's sort of gets off on a bad foot from the beginning, and never really, her reputation is terribly unfair. Reading your book, obviously I would say that, but it does seem as though her early years are really sort of set the precedent for her reputation in England.
No, I don't. I mean, I think up to a point. I think you have to remember, I think it's partly because of the way that sort of history has been written. And so historians aren't always very good at remembering how people develop and change. And indeed, their reputation develops and changes over the course of their life. And so the girl of 15 is sometimes sort of presented to us as if she was exactly the same as a woman of 30, 40, 50, which is ridiculous. As I said, she was 15 when she arrived in England, and Charles treated her very badly, actually, and she reacted like and the Anglo-French alliance was falling apart, which didn't make life easy for either of them. And she did react sometimes like an extremely angry teenager, which I must say, I find quite funny how she would. There's one terrible scene when they're sitting in bed together, and she says, by the way, this is a list of people I want to run my estates. And he says, no, but they're French. You can't have any French people running your estates in England. And then she throws a complete wobbly and says, my life is miserable and it's all your fault, and how can you do this to me? And he's sort of completely stunned as king, and a divine right monarch, and he can't believe he's being treated like that. But in the sense that I suppose you say her reputation is fixed, she was she was a Catholic, and therefore that was always going to be a stick to beat Charles with. People were and remain obsessed by the example of Eve. Eve who seduced Adam in the Garden of Eden. I'm sorry, poor old Adam. Poor old Adam, led by his penis or whatever, was incapable of saying no to Eve, and so this poor innocent bloke was corrupted by this sort of fiendish woman. That view of women remains and was used very much against Henrietta Maria, forgetting perhaps, as I said, that she was a 15-year-old girl in a country of 5 million Protestants and about 5,000 Catholics, and he was a divine right monarch of 25.
How much was it that she was Catholic and how much that she was French?
That's a very good question. The one inflated the difficulties of the other. I think Anne of Denmark is reputed, who was James's wife, King James's wife, who was raised as a Lutheran, which in itself, by the way, was considered popish, because they weren't considered sort of low church enough. So Lutherans were considered popish anyway. That was very disapproved of in Scotland when she was Queen of Scots, before James also became King of England. But Denmark wasn't a great power in the way that France was a great power. France and Spain were the great powers, and so the fact that she was not only Catholic but a daughter of this great power was sort of doubled or tripled or quadrupled even the perceived problems of her Catholicism.
Well, her early years of marriage, she was treated very badly by, obviously you've mentioned Charles, but also Buckingham, Charles's partner in crime, until he was assassinated. How much was Buckingham? Henrietta Maria was really a sort of a vehicle for him to get at his enemies in France, wasn't she? Rather than any great animosity towards her.
Well, she was a child, so I don't think I think that as you suggest, she was used by Buckingham, but not only in his arguments with Richelieu in particular in France, but also in England. So he had many Puritan enemies or enemies on that side of the Church of England. I mean, he had lots of different people who hated him for different reasons, but they were one group who particularly hated him. And so he would try and I suppose weaken their attacks on him. He would attack Henrietta Maria. He would attack her Catholicism and so forth. Yes, so he again, she was used as a straw man, you might say.
France's treatment of Protestants, and I guess you get the reverse in England, don't you, with England's treatment of Catholics. France was a lot more tolerant, was it?
When she was growing up, it was. Her father had introduced these edicts of Nantes, which her mother and brother reissued more than once, which permitted Huguenots who were Calvinists, Protestants, to practice their religion in France. And so if you look at things, and this was the France that she was brought up in and that she left when she was 15. And so you can see from Henrietta Maria's perspective that she did not see why it would not be possible for England not to have the same system for Catholics. But I think that, there were reasons why that wouldn't happen. I think one of the reasons was that Protestantism was being rolled back in Europe, and English Protestants felt threatened and fearful. Perhaps more than they need to have done it in England, but they did.
One thing that struck me about her is that she's entirely sensible during certainly the early years of the Civil War. She's giving decent advice to Charles. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask though was the moment when Charles decides to storm into the House of Commons and attempt to arrest 5 MPs, which she seemed to have been blamed for, but that's very unfair because that was Charles deciding to march.
It's Charles's decision. Yeah, she often gets blamed for Charles's decisions, and again, you do see this often in history. It's that
the woman gets blamed.
Yeah, exactly. You can't bring yourself to blame the man maybe because he's a king, and you don't want to blame a king, or you don't want to blame some hero, or in the case of Charles, not a hero. But it's it is sort of blame them. We see this actually with Prince Harry and Meghan, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, Prince Harry is not supposed to be. It doesn't have a reputation of being a genius, but he has capacity, as they might say. He has capacity. He's not actually a vegetable. He must be capable of some of his own decisions and thoughts. So whatever we may think about Meghan, the fact is that Harry is responsible for his own decisions. We can't blame it on his wife.
No.
Equally with Charles, you can't blame his decisions on his wife.
There's a key moment though, which Charles is always should rightly be blamed for, is that and you're going to know exactly what year we are because
well, let's hope exactly.
Well, it's a point where we're in the Civil War. The Royalists are for once sort of on top, and if they choose to go to London,
oh yes,
then that seems to be a key turning point. Right, well done.
Summer of 1643. Yes, I know. Absolutely. They've had the Royalists are absolutely on a roll. Thanks in considerable part to Henrietta Maria's efforts. She's brought many money, men, arms from Europe.
And this is incredible in itself, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. She's been very, very successful. And one of the things I find so fascinating as well is how people go to see her because they're told that she's more reliable figure than Charles. But the fact of the matter is, and the parliamentarians say that she's wearing the breeches, and I think to myself, gosh, she must often wish and not only her, but she must often wish she was wearing the breeches, because the fact of the matter is that he was king and he made the decisions at the end of the day. And one of these decisions was that she said in the summer of 1643, now is the moment to go and take London. They're having riots in London. As I said, they'd had a string of royalist victories, and Charles said no. He was going off. He was going to stomp off to Gloucester, and an opportunity was lost. And she believed that was a turning point because the Scots were on the point of joining the war on the side of the parliamentarians, and once they of the English Parliament, and once they did, the numbers would be against Charles, and it was going to be very, very difficult for him to win the Civil War after that. And she saw this as the great turning point, and it was even mentioned as actually in her funeral, that this was the turning, as she saw it, certainly the turning point in the Civil War. And she went back to France, in fact, the following year, to try and salvage what she could and get more money, men and arms. But things went downhill really from that point. The Scots joined the war, joined the parliamentarians in January 1644, and 1645 he gave up.
Yeah, you've written an award-winning book, The White King, all about Charles I. And what I wondered was, did you find whilst writing this book, which I think The White King could sort of presents him, it's a sort of revisionist history, presents him in a positive light. Did you find writing this book, Henrietta Maria is really being blamed for Charles's blunders here and there, and so perhaps he's not, does it make you sort of rethink your
no, I mean, I felt when I was writing White King, I was completely fascinated by Henrietta Maria, and but I had to sort of, obviously my focus was on Charles, and so I had to sort of be quite careful to sort of restrain that interest, which was why I wrote this book. My agent was very against it at first and said to me, "Oh no, you can't do a biography of Henrietta. I mean, people just think it's the boring stuff you left out." And she's always very direct and to the point, which is a good thing, I think. And I was saying, no, really, I promise you, it's not going to be boring stuff I left out. But I suppose this one is, I think, also sympathetic, perhaps less sympathetic. So White King was a sympathetic, or is a sympathetic portrayal of Charles. And and a part of that was that I felt that there'd been too much kind of sort of, the view of Charles had become too negative and was really sort of turning people off the whole period. I think, who's going to want to read about this fascinating period of history if this central figure, i.e. Charles, is just a sort of pathetic moronic dweeb, which he wasn't. And so I wanted to explain to people how he thought, the kind of man he was, so they could understand, for example, why was he, what did it mean for him to be a divine right monarch? This wasn't a man who was just flouncing around in lace saying, "I am marvelous me, I think I am God," that there was first of all, he'd inherited these ideas from his father. And secondly, there was a very a side to it that we could all understand and relate to, that it was about preventing, it was response to religious extremism, you might say, and terrorism indeed. So that was one of the things I wanted to achieve with White King, is to explain the complexities, to explain this central figure, Charles the King, and why he had so many people support him, people who were willing to die for this man. So there was that. And as I was doing the book, as I said, I became very fascinated by the figure of his wife, who's another sort of very sort of despised figure, and who I came to realize was actually a very extraordinary woman. Whereas Charles, I think, is a sympathetic figure, but he was a failed king and he had major flaws. I suppose we all have flaws, but Charles's flaws were quite striking. Here you had a really extraordinary woman, and one who I felt people would like to be introduced to. I think another problem with this period, the 17th century, and not just the Civil War, but the first half of the 17th century, but particularly the reign of Charles I, is it's seen as very masculine. It's all kind of, warty parliamentarians against sort of Rupert of the Rhine figures charging around with their great swords or whatever. Whereas there are, in fact, and whereas the Tudors, on the other hand, have all these amazing queens and queen consorts, and and is a very popular period. And so again, it's also about getting the balance and showing people not only because it's a fascinating time full of fascinating male figures, but also fascinating and powerful women, female figures.
And all the women of the families at the time, all these huge families, these significant major dynasties all over Europe, presumably were all of the same mind as Charles, in that, their opponents, their political opponents were, they believed in the divine right of kings themselves, kings and queens themselves. They weren't going to have any truck with what Parliament was thinking.
No, I mean, I think with the thing with divine right kingship as well is that it was a question of where people, a lot of people, I mean, in MPs as well, believed that kings drew their authority from God. I suppose there were questions about where the balance lay, with Parliament. And yes, European monarchs also believed, in a sense, in divine right kingship, but not in quite the same way. I mean, the key difference was that people think of divine right being a sort of, again, they think it's something to be some way associated with Henrietta Maria, because it must somehow be Catholic, because people think of Protestantism as being a sort of great step on the path to democracy, and therefore, if you're Catholic, you're obviously not going to be on the great stepping towards the sort of marvelous democracy.
Yes. Oliver Cromwell, that great Democrat. Yes.
Well, I know exactly. But actually, the thing about English, the Stuart divine right kingship was that he'd inherited a lot of his ideas from Henry VIII. The point was that the king was not just a secular head, but also a religious head. He was head of the Church of England. He was governor of the Church of England. He was a pope in England. So, which of course the kings of France and Spain didn't quite claim. I mean, they certainly thought they were very important and used to get very annoyed if they didn't get their way, but with the Pope or whatever. But fact of the matter is, they didn't claim that they had a religious role in the way the Pope did, whereas the kings of England did, which had its problems, because when you had Charles come along and say, right, I think the Church of England we should have sort of stained glass windows or whatever, and we need to beautify our churches, and I don't think it's respectable to God not to sort of to have one's churches looking like barns rather than being beautified. And I'm perfectly in favor, and church music is a part of that, and I think kneeling is important because it shows respect or whatever. Then you're going to get sort of what we would think of as low church Protestants. These are modern terms which they wouldn't have used then, but more Calvinists viewpoints regarded that as popish, which doesn't mean Catholic exactly. It just means moving away from sort of Calvinism, and that was obviously a problem. So you suddenly got the head of the church saying things you don't believe.
I guess it's interesting you say that. It's an important distinction to make between Charles being the head of the church and his European counterparts not being so. Which it's something that one often forgets, particularly when these European monarchs seem so powerful in their own areas.
Yes, it's absolutely, it's that, and it's also the way I do think it's sort of I think we're unaware of the way that we have been raised to think about things as well. So, like I said, there is this sort of great idea that, I mean, you even have sort of Ian Duncan Smith, who was a cradle Catholic, saying, the Reformation, started our sort of break from
Brexit,
Europe,
yes.
a nonsense, and secondly, there was sort of stomping along on the path of democracy. Just think to yourself, what the hell are you talking about, you lunatic? But anyway. So Henrietta Maria strangely becomes a sort of victim of that, and one of the things that's said about her is that she turns Charles Catholic, and at the same time we know that Charles was named a martyr of the Church of England, and you can't be a martyr of the Church of England, the Protestant Church of England, and be a Catholic. You can be one or the other. You can't be both.
Surely that's viewed as pure puritanical or parliamentarian propaganda. I mean, absolute bollocks.
But I come across on Twitter and things all the time that people sort of have absorbed a lot of parliamentary propaganda.
I see. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the execution of Charles I as it affected Henrietta Maria. Obviously, I've discussed the execution with Mark Turnbull, who you may be familiar with.
Oh yes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and we actually had a very interesting chat, and he's sympathetic to Charles I, and after a conversation with him and having...
He thinks he knows who the executioner was, doesn't he?
Oh, we didn't talk about that.
Yeah, I think so.
He's coming back in January to talk, because that's the anniversary.
He's got a book coming out, hasn't he?
Yes.
Yes, I think that's right. Oh, well, you can ask him.
I shall ask him. And it's funny, we've been talking about how... Or rather, you've been talking about how hopeless Charles I was, or his many mishaps. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the trial and execution of Charles I, which is where Charles comes out very well. For once in his life, he performs admirably. But I was interested in how this affected Henrietta Maria, because there's an interesting, there's an interesting line in early on in the book where she's traveling to England, and she's reminded, she is constantly reminded of 4 queens or 4 female or queen consorts had been executed, and that's right. Yeah, I mean, so it's almost as if an axe hanging over her head when she's a child, and then her husband is executed in 1649.
Yes, absolutely. And she's two queens are particularly mentioned. One is Anne Boleyn, who's a queen consort, as she was, and she's told by Buckingham at one point. She's told, by the way, queens of England lose their heads, when he's trying to put her in her place. And she's also reminded before she leaves that Charles's grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed and is seen in France as a kind of Catholic martyr. And she's told that one day she may be expected to die in the same way. And indeed, during the Civil War, an impeachment process is put in place. And they do try quite hard, the parliamentarians, to kill her, actually, at various points. But it's her husband who is executed, which I think comes as a huge shock to her. I mean, she knows she's in France, she's in Paris, she's in the Louvre. She knows Charles has been on trial. She hasn't been given permission to return to London to be with him, which she wants to do despite the fact her own life would be at such risk. And she, hopes that the French will sending diplomats, ambassadors, and others to prevent Charles's execution. And then she's told that oh, by the way, he has been taken to the scaffold, but the crowd have come. They came and they saved him. And she sends off a messenger to find out if this is true to her sister-in-law, who's Queen Regent of France. And he doesn't come back. The messenger doesn't come back, and the messenger doesn't come back. And she's sitting there having, eating lunch in the Louvre. And eventually someone says, oh, well, it must be bad news. And she suddenly realizes that she's been lied to and that he's dead. And she's told that, yes, indeed, he has been executed. And she goes into a sort of state of shock, and she doesn't move or speak. And there's this sort of description of her sitting there, and darkness falls. And eventually one of her relations takes her by the hand and leads her from the room. But this is not the end of her life. It's the end of her husband's life. And she lives for another sort of 20 years, and a very full and interesting life it is too. So my book goes on very much beyond the execution of her husband.
The Phoenix Queen, she rises.
Exactly. One of the things that struck me so much is that, because you have a sort of decade of sort of misery until
well, there are some historians who would disagree.
About her being
I meant the interregnum. Were you
sorry, it's terrible for her. I mean, maybe lovely if you're a Cromwellian, but if you're a royalist in Paris living on sort of two beans, then not so great. So what I mean by that is it was horrible for her.
Sorry.
Yes. I think it was very nice if you were Mrs. Cromwell, for example, sitting in a lovely sort of palace in London. But so not so great for her. But anyway, in 1660, her son is restored, and he becomes Charles II. Hooray, hurrah! From her perspective, and from the perspective of all the royalists. But what is so fascinating is that the sort of image that we're presented to of Henrietta Maria at this point is she returns to England, and the diarist Samuel Pepys sees her at court, and he describes her as dressed in black and looking very ordinary. And this is how she's often left, as if, she's a miserable old crone, and okay, the royalists are back, and, the merry monarch's having a merry time. But, and I wonder why that is. And I think it's because, again, she's still being cast as Eve. And what Eve wants is Eve is an agent of Satan. Satan wants chaos. Satan wants civil war, which is chaos. So naturally, this daughter of Eve can't celebrate and enjoy her son's restoration. So we leave her as this sort of pathetic, withered, sort of defeated figure. But the fact is that she was dressed in black and not feeling at her chirpiest because, her youngest son had just died. And none of us might feel at our chirpiest at that moment. But what we're not told is Samuel Pepys, writing another description of her 2 years later, in which he says that her court is, you know, the merriest than that of the Merry Monarch, that it's the greatest court in England, and that everyone flocks there and, you know, having a lovely time. Describes her having an absolute ball. And she writes to her sister at one point saying that she's as happy as she's ever been. And she is, again, a powerful figure. You know, her son is restored. She's been through many tragedies, but she's extremely resilient. And she's described as a sort of phoenix queen who rises from the ashes of the Civil War. And that's absolutely the person she is. She has risen from the ashes of the Civil War.
I was interested in her relationship with her second eldest son, James II.
Yes.
Because he's an absolute disaster.
I know. After she died, though, let us not forget.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not blaming Henrietta Maria for James II. I think that would be very unfair.
I think it would be, but it wouldn't be. I mean, I wouldn't put it past some people, to be honest.
Well, I know. I mean, that's the thing. All the weaknesses in the males are blamed on Henrietta Maria. It seems, you know, it's very unfair. So by that logic, one would have to apportion the successes to her as well. But James II was a disaster. What was her relationship like with James II? Well, he wasn't James II, was he? But
no, he was just James, Duke of York. What was it? Well, she was a great. I mean, she was a very physically a tiny person with a very big personality. And as her mother was Marie de Medici, who was no shrinking violet either. And what is fascinating about her relationship with her children is that she loved all her children, and all her children loved her. But she had quarrels with them. I mean, you know, she quarreled to the absolute death with some of them. I mean, the tragic case of Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who was the one who had just died when she was seen dressed in black. She had wanted him to convert to Catholicism. When he arrived in France, he was just a boy from memory 14 or something. She felt that this would be better for his future. The Stuart cause was a very low ebb. So if he became a Catholic, quite apart from the fact that she obviously believed it would be better for his soul, she also thought, well, he'd be able to marry a nice rich Catholic wife, or he could be made a cardinal, or, you know, he could generally have some power and money and general jolliness. And when he said no, he wasn't going to do that, unsurprisingly, his last memory of his father was his father about to go to the scaffold and saying that one of the things he was dying for was, the Church of England and so forth. She threw him out, and was on sort of non-speakers with him for years. But again, she's seen as a sort of monster mother for this for this reason. But in fact, her sister-in-law, the Winter Queen of Bohemia, did exactly the same with her. She who was a Protestant, whose children became Catholics. If you were a queen, and particularly if you're a queen in exile, as both of them were, you could not afford to be seen as weak. You could not afford to have your your children not doing as they're told. She needed to look formidable to help raise money and so forth for her son Charles II. And she was after the Restoration, she was looking forward, as she wrote, to being reunited with her children, including Henry. And then, of course, he died. He died before they were reunited. It was absolutely heartbreaking. But anyway, so I'm slightly moving on from James here. But with James as well, she got very annoyed with James because James married a commoner. And she was appalled by this. Why was he as a member of a royal dynasty, he should be marrying a royal princess that would bring power and wealth to the Stuarts and to England and Scotland. Influence, it should have been more of a political marriage. So she was furious about that. But interestingly, when one of her daughters died, so she arrived back in England. Her son Henry had died. James had married Clarendon's daughter, and she was extremely annoyed, as I was saying. But then her daughter Mary died, and she was obviously shattered by this, and she obviously simply couldn't keep up her display of, anger with James. And so before she returned to France, as she did for a period of time, as she did that January from memory, she sort of kissed and made up with James and his wife. It's all very human, if you see what I mean.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking that James marrying a commoner must have blown her mind, given all the different families' blood she's got rushing through her body.
Yes, I think she was completely outraged. I mean, both of her sons were, philanderers and womanizers, but she couldn't understand, I suppose, why he actually had to go ahead and marry this girl. And she hoped to sort of end it. She hoped to, I suppose, to get an annulment of some sort. She had a ruthless streak. Henrietta Maria wasn't a saint. I mean, she had actually some quite saintly qualities in a way, but she wasn't a saint. And she was extremely tough and could be very hard nosed. And that was one area.
The Phoenix Queen, I mean, in a way, she rises again, doesn't she? Because in William and Harry,
yes,
we have direct descendants.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. They're descended from her because they are descended from, I think, two of Charles II, the children of Charles II by his mistresses, by two of his mistresses. So
this would be down through the Diana Spencer.
Yes. Absolutely, through Diana. They are descended through Diana, Princess of Wales. They are descended from Henrietta Maria. Yes, so she's back. She'd be delighted.
And she's I didn't know this, and she's the great state of Maryland in the United States of America is named after her.
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely, Maryland is absolutely named after her. Yes, and often I think people get confused and think it was named after one of the other Marys, but no, it was named after. Sometimes she was called Queen Mary. Henrietta Maria, she was called different things. And there was a brief period when she was called Queen Henry when she first arrived in England. They weren't quite sure what to call her. So she was Queen Henry. And I think that would have been quite cool. I think Henry would have been a rather good name for her. But
yeah. Well, we're coming to the end. She's clearly a fascinating character. I mean, I like the fact that she brought sort of a bit of fun to the English court, being French, just despite being French.
Yeah, all because I mean,
Yes.
Suddenly the art of conversation, and there was a brilliant quote I came across with some sort of stuffy old English peer saying, because Charles II, of course, was very influenced by his mother and by his time in France, and this crusty old peer complained bitterly about this fashion for talking, chatting. And no, she loved chatting, and she had a great sense of humor, actually, and that's one of the things I hope comes across in the book. Is actually she was very funny.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think she's got certainly thanks to this book, she's got a very reputation to be proud of.
Well, I think it's, she had good in her and bad in her, dark and light, like as everyone does. But she's a very interesting and powerful character, and one I think many readers would warm to, or even if they don't warm to her, will find her interesting. She's certainly not boring.
Absolutely not. I mean, early parts of it read like the Dumas novels. They're the Three Musketeers. Yes, it really is.
Well, that's where he got it from.
Yeah, indeed. Leanda, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to chat.
Thank you.
Coming up, I've got Tessa Dunlop on the Crown TV series and Elizabeth and Philip's early life. I've got Ian McGregor talking about Stalingrad, Peter Hughes on history and today's society, and a bonus on top 10 historical movies, a showdown with my list up against film director Tim Hewitt's own top 10 to decide the ultimate aspects of history top 10 historical films. I hope you can join me. Thank you and good night.